Before we begin this unsettling journey into a chapter of history most would rather keep buried, take a moment to steady your thoughts. What you're about to hear is not just a story. It is a wound sealed under silence, a love carved into the darkness of a world built on chains. As you listen, I invite you to do something simple but powerful. Comment your location and the exact time you are watching this. Let it be a small act of witness, a reminder that across miles and years, we gather here to remember what history tried to erase. This is Grave of the Shadows, and if you find truth in forgotten voices, subscribe now so you never walk alone through stories like this again. The year is 1847. The air over rural Georgia hangs thick with heat and quiet judgment. Cotton fields stretch endlessly beneath a sun that seems to watch without blinking. Wealth, power, obedience. These are the laws carved into the soil. On a hill overlooking nearly 800 acres stands the Caldwell estate, pristine and silent, a monument to Southern gentility. White columns gleam in the light like polished bones. Carriages arrive. Names carry weight. Appearances are everything. But beneath the lace and manners, something stirs. A quiet rebellion that no one sees coming. History often speaks of wars, generals, and blood-soaked fields, but rarely does it whisper of two young women who chose love over legacy, and two enslaved men who dared to dream beyond their chains. Tonight, we walk their path. Step carefully. Some stories don't just haunt, they judge. The American South in 1847 was a world balanced on illusion, an illusion of honor, refinement, and order. Behind the polished silverware and Sunday church gatherings lay a truth far colder, an economy built on human bondage and a social code maintained through fear disguised as tradition. In places like Wilkes County, Georgia, change did not simply arrive. It had to bleed its way in. The Caldwell plantation was not the largest in the region, but it was among the most respected. Visitors described it as a place where the old world still breathed, where young women were raised like fragile porcelain, and men measured their worth in acres and obedience. To be a Caldwell was to be untouchable, at least in public. The family name was spoken with a mixture of admiration and envy, a symbol of Southern aristocracy in its purest, most unchallenged form. Life on the estate moved with ritualistic precision. At dawn, the field stirred with movement as enslaved men and women stepped into rows of cotton before the sun had fully risen. Overseers watched from horseback, eyes sharp, silence stricter than any whip. By afternoon, the main house came alive with laughter, tea service, and classical music echoing through tall halls. Two worlds coexisted on the same soil, one gilded, one shackled, never meant to touch, never meant to see one another as human. But history has a way of cracking even the strongest illusions. Beyond the manicured gardens and grand staircase, just past a line of oak trees that stood like silent sentries, lay the slave quarters, small wooden cabins, humble and overlooked, where names were spoken softly at night, for fear they might disappear by morning. Here, hope had to be hidden, love had to be silent, education had to be a secret, and dreams of freedom, those were buried deepest of all, until two sisters crossed that invisible line. From a distance, the Caldwell estate looked like something pulled from a painting, precisely trimmed hedges, white columns catching the light like a cathedral, and a long gravel road lined with magnolia trees, guiding visitors toward a world that pretended to be untouched by hardship. Every corner of the property seemed designed to send a message. Here, power does not just exist, it performs. Neighbors spoke of Thomas Caldwell, patriarch, as a man of discipline and vision. They admired how he maintained order without scandal, how his land prospered, while others struggled against crop failures and rising tensions between North and South. Yet those same admirers lowered their voices when they spoke his name, as if respect and fear were two parts of the same breath. He was a man who believed in legacy above all things, and legacy in the South required control of image, of land, and of every soul tied to it. Inside the main house, chandeliers flickered above ballroom floors polished smooth by decades of rehearsed elegance. Guests glided through its corridors during social gatherings, unaware, or unwilling to acknowledge that just beyond the estate's manicured edge, 70 enslaved individuals labored to sustain the illusion of Southern grace. Their hands polished the silver, tended the roses, stitched the gowns, and served the tea. Their presence was constant, yet their humanity was deliberately erased in the very spaces they maintained. To the county, the Caldwell family represented everything honorable about the Old South. To those who lived in the shadows of its grandeur, it was something else entirely, a place where silence was survival and where a single misstep could end a life without a record. It was within this world of rigid beauty and unspoken cruelty that Elizabeth and Catherine Caldwell grew up. They were raised not to question, but to continue. But fate, or perhaps something more defiant, had other plans. Because the thing about tightly controlled worlds is this: once a single crack appears, the truth begins to seep through like water through stone. Elizabeth and Catherine Caldwell were, to all who saw them, the embodiment of Southern grace. Identical in appearance, same dark hair pinned in perfect curls, same pale complexion untouched by sun, same delicate posture practiced through years of etiquette lessons. They moved through society like reflections in a mirror. The only difference, often mentioned in quiet admiration by those who observed them, was the small birthmark above their right eyebrows, a flawless imperfection copied twice by fate. They were praised, adored, presented at every social gathering like prized heirlooms, waiting to be claimed by suitable husbands of equal status. Every smile they gave was rehearsed. Every word they spoke had been taught. They were not daughters. They were legacy. But beneath the lace gloves and soft laughter, something unspoken lingered. While other young women, their age, eagerly entertained the promise of wealth through marriage, the Caldwell twins carried an unsettling stillness about them, a silence that felt less like compliance and more like observation. They watched. They listened. They noticed what others refused to see. Servants recalled finding them wandering near the edge of the estate at dusk, their silhouettes barely visible against the fading light, eyes fixed not on the grand house behind them, but on the distant cabins below the hill. It was considered an odd habit, but excused with polite explanations. They enjoy the fresh air, guests would say. The twins have gentle hearts. But whispers began to form in the corners of drawing rooms. Why do they spend so much time away from the gatherings? Why do they walk alone instead of sitting with the other girls? Why do they look unsettled when they have everything? No one could have imagined it then, but that quiet unrest, the kind only visible in glances, in pauses too long, in the way their smiles rarely reached their eyes, was not a flaw. It was the beginning of fracture, and fractures, once formed, do not stay small. In a world as rigidly controlled as the Caldwell estate, even the smallest deviation became noticeable to those who lived long enough in its shadow. Margaret Sullivan, the family's long-serving housekeeper, was one such observer. She had been in the Caldwell home longer than the twins themselves, trusted to oversee the household with silent efficiency. She knew the rhythm of the estate, the hour each bell sounded, the exact tone Thomas Caldwell used when displeased, the unspoken rules no servant dared to break. So when the twins began to alter their routines, Margaret noticed before anyone else. At first, it was small things. The sisters delayed their morning piano practice, claiming headaches. They skipped social tea to walk for health, their white dresses drifting like ghosts toward the direction of the oak line that marked the boundary between the main estate and the slave quarters. Margaret watched them from the upper veranda one afternoon, her hands paused mid-task. The twins moved with purpose, their posture too straight, their steps too focused for a casual stroll. Still, she said nothing, but silence does not erase suspicion, it preserves it. Rumor among the household staff began to stir like wind through dry leaves. One kitchen maid whispered that she had seen Miss Catherine speaking softly to someone near the old stables after sundown. Another claimed she saw Miss Elizabeth lingering at the edge of the workers' path, her gloved hand brushing against something, or someone, hidden by the shadows. One evening, Margaret found a scrap of paper tucked under a stack of linens in the twins' quarters. It was blank, except for a single, careful line written in a hand too elegant to belong to any of the enslaved men. The moon will be new. It is better to walk when the sky has no witness. She folded it silently and placed it back where she found it. Some truths, she knew, were not meant to be carried aloud, and in that quiet act of returning the note, without a word to anyone, the first unspoken alliance was formed. Among the 70 enslaved individuals on the Caldwell plantation, 2 names would one day be spoken differently, first in fear, then in secrecy, and much later in reverence. Samuel and Elijah. To most, they were just 2 more laboring bodies, listed in estate records with nothing but first names, ages, and price of purchase. Their humanity, officially, ended there. But what the records did not reveal was this: both men could read. They had not been born into literacy. It had been stolen, quietly, dangerously, during their years on a failing South Carolina plantation, where the previous overseer's children, in a moment of careless innocence or secret rebellion, had taught them the alphabet. Letters became words. Words became power. And in the South of 1847, power in the hands of the enslaved was considered more dangerous than fire. So Samuel and Elijah buried their knowledge deep, speaking it only through glances and the occasional glimpse of a torn newspaper hidden inside their work shirts. Their survival depended on silence. But fate does not always respect caution. One late autumn evening, Catherine Caldwell, taking a solitary route past the stable to avoid another suffocating dinner conversation, stopped in her tracks. There, beneath the fading light, she saw Samuel, head bowed, hand steady, not working but reading. A discarded newspaper, crumpled and dirt-stained, lay in his grasp like contraband. For a moment, neither moved. The world seemed to hold its breath between them. Catherine could have screamed. Samuel could have begged. Instead, something far stranger happened. She asked him quietly, "What does it say?" Samuel hesitated, his eyes measuring her not as a mistress, but as a threat. Then, against every survival instinct carved into his bones, he read aloud. His voice was low, steady, and unlike anything she had ever heard from a man called Property. The words were simple, a report on trade routes and cotton prices, but to Catherine, it sounded like a confession, a door opening into a world she had never been allowed to see. From that moment, something irreversible ignited. Elijah, too, would soon cross that unseen threshold, meeting Elizabeth near the garden rows under the pretense of discussing soil and planting, yet exchanging more in silence than words ever allowed. It was not love at first sight. Love, in their world, was too dangerous to be romantic. Before love came recognition, of intellect, of humanity, of equal fire hidden beneath 2 entirely different kinds of cages. And recognition, once awakened, refuses to return to sleep. Love did not come to them like a sweeping storm. It arrived like a whisper, subtle, deliberate, written between lines not meant to be read. Catherine began it. After that evening at the stables, her world no longer aligned the way it used to. The music in the parlor felt hollow. The polite laughter at dinner sounded rehearsed. The estate, once a place of structured elegance, now felt like a gilded cage. And somewhere beyond its polished corridors, Samuel walked the grounds with the quiet dignity of a man who knew the taste of forbidden knowledge. Her first note was careful, too careful to be labeled affection, just curious enough to excuse if discovered. "The winter winds are coming early this year. I wonder if the nights feel colder in the stables." She did not sign it. Samuel found it tucked beneath the water bucket near the horse trough. He read it twice before burning it in a discreet corner of the barn. His reply was spoken, not written. The next time he was called to bring firewood to the main house, he paused just long enough in the corridor where she waited in the shadow of a doorway, and said quietly, "Cold is a matter of the heart more than the air." From then on, letters became their language, tiny folded messages, hidden in gloves, between pages of poetry books, under loose stones near the garden wall. They never used names. Instead, they signed with single letters, C and S, as if even initials could ignite the wrath of the world around them. Elizabeth discovered the secret not by accident, but by intuition. She had noticed the soft shift in her sister's demeanor, the way Catherine's eyes no longer looked at things, but through them. One evening, she followed her and saw the exchange, Catherine placing a folded scrap near the oak roots, and Elijah retrieving it moments later. There was a pause. Elijah looked up. Elizabeth did not run. She stepped forward, and in that moment, without a word spoken, a second thread bound itself to the first. From then on, it was not one secret but four. Twin sisters, two enslaved men, a series of letters no one was meant to find. And somewhere between those exchanges, something far more dangerous than affection began to form. Pact. Because love may begin in silence, but rebellion begins when silence is shared. The illusion of control can hold for years, until a single sentence shatters it. On the evening of March 15th, 1847, the Caldwell dining room glowed with candlelight. A formal dinner had been arranged, the kind where conversation was polished, and even the silverware placement felt rehearsed. Elizabeth and Catherine sat across from their father, their expressions composed, their posture flawless. To any outsider, it would have looked like a portrait of Southern grace. Then Thomas Caldwell cleared his throat. "I have secured marriage arrangements for both of you," he announced, his tone firm, not celebratory. "You will be wed to the sons of the Powell and Harrow families. The unions will strengthen our standing and ensure the Caldwell legacy continues." The words landed not like invitations, but like verdicts. Catherine's fingers tightened around her glass. Elizabeth blinked once, slowly. On the surface, they remained still, trained since childhood to mask their true thoughts behind manners. But inside, something fractured with a sharp, silent crack. Marriage in their world was not love. It was transaction, a transfer of bloodlines, property, and expectation. Once the papers were signed, once they were claimed by powerful Southern families, their lives would no longer be theirs to choose. There would be no walks past the oak line, no letters hidden in poetry books, no midnight glances filled with unspoken rebellion. That night, in the privacy of their room, the twins did not cry. They did not argue. They simply stood by the window, watching the distant lanterns flicker near the slave quarters, and understood with cold clarity. If they stayed, their fate would be sealed. If they left, they might never return. Marriage was no longer a social expectation. It had become a deadline, and under that looming deadline, the quiet affection they had nurtured in shadows sharpened into something far more dangerous: resolve. March 18th, 1847. The night began like any other, quiet, still, obedient. But beneath that calm, for people moved with the precision of those who knew that one mistake could cost them their lives. The moon was new, as planned, dark, invisible, offering natural cover. Samuel and Elijah had spent the day working in silence, feeling the weight of every step, every glance from the overseers. The twins played their roles at supper flawlessly, smiling when expected, speaking only when spoken to. No one noticed how their eyes avoided each other, not of guilt, but out of focus, every thought fixed on nightfall. At 11:47 p.m., while the estate slept under a cloak of false peace, Catherine struck the first spark. A small storage shed near the slave quarters, filled with dry tools and old grain sacks, caught flame with terrifying ease. The fire was not meant to destroy. It was meant to distract. Within minutes, shouts rang across the lower fields. Overseers jolted awake. Bells sounded. Men rushed toward the blaze, shouting orders, dragging water barrels. And while every gaze was fixed on the fire, for shadows slipped into the dark edge of the woods. Elizabeth and Elijah first, moving toward the tree line where a narrow gap in the fence had been loosened days before. Catherine and Samuel followed seconds later, their breaths controlled, their footsteps soft against the ground. Catherine did not look back at the house she had called home all her life. Samuel did, not out of longing, but to ensure no light followed them. They moved quickly along a route memorized through whispered planning and stolen moments. Samuel carried a small satchel. Inside were only 3 items: a loaf of bread, a folded map hand drawn from memory, and a single page from Catherine's diary. Behind them, the fire roared higher. Overseers shouted for more men. Dogs barked in confusion. Then someone noticed. Where are the Caldwell girls? A silence fell, brief, sharp, then shattered by panic. Within minutes, the search began. Riders were sent in all directions. Dogs were unleashed. Lanterns cut through the darkness like knives. Tracks were searched. Orders were screamed. Find them. Bring them back. To the world beyond those fields, it would appear that 2 innocent daughters had been taken, dragged into the night by dangerous men. That lie would spread faster than the fire itself. But the truth moved quieter, for figures disappearing into the woods, for heartbeats pounding in unison, not captives, runaways. By dawn, the fire was nothing more than smoldering ash. The shed was gone, but the damage it caused was nothing compared to what was discovered next. The Caldwell sisters' rooms were found untouched, beds neatly made, dresses carefully hung, nothing visibly disturbed. But the windows were unlatched, and a single drawer stood half open, like a breath left unfinished. Thomas Caldwell stood in the doorway for a long time, saying nothing, not a word of anger, not a cry of grief, just silence, cold and absolute. When the overseer delivered his report, he did not speak their names. Instead, he said, "The girls have been taken." Taken, a word that preserved dignity, that painted the daughters as victims, not accomplices. It was easier to believe in abduction than betrayal, easier to imagine violent theft than willing escape. Thomas Caldwell did not sit down for the next 3 days. He rode with the search parties at dawn, issued orders at noon, and stared across the fields at dusk as if sheer willpower could call his daughters back. Food went untouched. Letters were written to neighboring estates, warning of 2 dangerous men and 2 helpless daughters. Posters were planned. Rewards were tallied. But late on the 3rd night, a letter arrived, not from authorities, nor from a witness, but from the unknown. No one knows precisely what it said, but those who were present claimed that Thomas read only the first few lines before his face drained of all color. His hand trembled. The letter slipped from his grasp, and with it, the illusion that his daughters had been taken against their will slip too. He did not scream. He did not curse. He simply closed his eyes and collapsed. The official cause recorded days later was apoplexy, an abrupt failure of the body. But those who whispered long after believed something else entirely. It was not his heart that failed him. It was his legacy. After Thomas Caldwell's death, the estate did not fall silent. It fell into order. His younger brother, Edward Caldwell, arrived from Charleston within the week. Where Thomas had ruled with presence, Edward ruled with paperwork. He did not rage. He did not mourn. Instead, he began sorting things into ledgers, names into lists, and truths into acceptable narratives. The official statement he delivered to neighboring plantations and local authorities was concise. "My nieces have been kidnapped by 2 fugitive slaves. We will pursue justice." No mention of letters. No mention of windows opened willingly. No mention of the truth that now lay folded in the corner of Thomas's study, pressed beneath the weight of family shame. Edward ordered the immediate creation of wanted notices, offering generous reward for the safe return of the Caldwell girls and the capture, dead or alive, of the enslaved men, Samuel and Elijah. His language was careful, legal, designed not just to hunt, but to erase choice from the story. He then turned inward, walking the halls of the estate like a man sealing a tomb. Servants were instructed to speak of the twins only when necessary. Their names were gradually removed from ledger headings. Their belongings were packed away. Their portraits were taken down from the hall and stored in a locked chest. In one final act of curated history, Edward stood before the plantation staff and delivered a statement not recorded in any archive, but remembered by those who heard it. From this day forward, let it be known, the Caldwell daughters were taken. They did not leave. That single line became law on the estate, an invented truth, cleaner than reality, easier to preserve than scandal. And so, the first draft of history was written, not in ink, but in silence. While the South searched for fugitives, the Caldwell estate did something far more devastating. It buried them while they were still alive. Freedom did not greet them with open arms. It met them like a cold wind, sharp, bracing, and honest. By late April of 1847, after weeks of moving by night and hiding by day, the four reached the outskirts of Philadelphia, a city where abolitionist whispers grew stronger than Southern law. But freedom there was not a celebration. It was quiet survival. They did not arrive as the Caldwell twins and the enslaved men of Georgia. They arrived as strangers with new names, spoken carefully like borrowed clothing. Catherine became Margaret Johnson, and Samuel took her surname, Samuel Johnson, not as a claim of ownership, but as an act of defiance. Elizabeth and Elijah chose another path, calling themselves Elijah and Elizabeth Davis, settling farther north near Boston, where fewer questions were asked. The world did not welcome them as heroes. It did not welcome them at all. They blended in. They disappeared by choice. Samuel found work tending horses, his steady hands and calm nature earning him quiet respect in a livery yard where no one asked about his past. Catherine, once dressed in silk and lace, now mended clothes in a small rented room above a bakery, her fingers learning a different kind of labor. Some nights she would pause, needle in hand, staring at the moonlit window and whisper, "We are free, we are free," as if saying it aloud made it real. Elizabeth and Elijah lived similarly. In the far north, where snow replaced Georgia's burning sun, Elijah worked wood, crafting furniture with precision, while Elizabeth taught local children to read, an act that would have been a crime in the place she once called home. To the neighbors, they were a quiet couple of modest means. No one saw rebellion when they passed by. No one saw the fire still burning quietly behind their eyes. But even in freedom, they lived under a shadow. Every knock at the door sounded like a memory of chains. Every unfamiliar footstep outside carried an echo of hounds and riders in the dark. Freedom, they learned, is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to walk forward despite it. And yet, in that fragile existence, something sacred took root. Children's laughter in a small northern home, dinner shared at a rough-hewn wooden table, hands reaching across years of danger, now held without fear. It was not the life they were born into. It was the life they chose. Years passed in cautious peace. Children grew. Seasons changed. And slowly, the urgency of escape faded into something softer memory. But memory has a way of tugging at the edges of the soul, pulling one back to unfinished places. In 1865, after the Civil War ended and the South stood broken and unrecognizable, Catherine made a decision that terrified even Samuel. She would return to Georgia, not to reclaim anything, but to face what had been left behind. She traveled under the name Margaret Johnson, dressed plainly, nothing about her resembling the young Southern heiress she once was. The Caldwell estate, once a symbol of power, now stood diminished, land sold off, fields neglected, its former glory reduced to tired walls and weary memories. Edward Caldwell received her in his study. He did not recognize her, not at first. Time had reshaped her features, but not her eyes. When she spoke his name, softly, deliberately, the room fell into a silence so thick it felt alive. The conversation that followed was not recorded officially, but years later, a letter written by Edward to his wife revealed fragments. Catherine did not beg. She did not apologize. She simply asked for one thing: to retrieve a small box that once belonged to her mother, left behind in the chaos of their escape. And more than that, she asked for acknowledgement, not public, not written, just an admission, spoken once, that she and her sister had chosen their fate. Edward refused, not out of hatred, but out of preservation. He could not allow the Caldwell name to be tied to willful rebellion, to interracial unions, to daughters who chose love over bloodline. He offered her money instead, and one condition: take it, leave, and never return to Georgia again. Catherine stood for a long moment in the doorway before she left. The man who had rewritten their story looked away first. She did not take the money. She took only what she came for, her mother's memory, and the knowledge that the past no longer owned her. The Caldwell plantation no longer stands. The fields where Samuel and Elijah once worked are now paved roads and quiet neighborhoods. Children play where overseers once rode. New houses rise where sorrow once slept. And somewhere beneath that earth, unmarked, unacknowledged, the footsteps of four people still echo against time. Elizabeth and Elijah lived out their days in Massachusetts, raising children who never knew the true cost of their mother's freedom. Samuel and Catherine lived quietly in Philadelphia until his passing, their love no longer a rebellion, but a life, modest, steady, unfinished in the eyes of history. None of them returned to Georgia again. Their names were never written in history books. No monument bears their memory. Yet their story survived, not through marble, but through letters hidden in floorboards, diaries sealed in walls, and truth passed quietly between generations until someone finally listened. And now you have heard it too. So ask yourself, what is legacy? Is it land? A surname carved into a gate? A family tree pruned to hide its branches? Or is it something else? Maybe legacy is a choice made in the dark, a hand taken when the world says it must not be touched, a step into the unknown when staying would be easier. Maybe legacy is not what we leave behind for the world to see, but what we carry within us, even when no one is watching. This was not just a love story. It was not just defiance. It was a quiet war against a world built on chains. And sometimes, the most powerful rebellions make no sound at all. History tried to bury them, but paper has a way of surviving where memory fails. For nearly 2 decades after Catherine's silent departure from Georgia, the official story of the Caldwell twins remained unchanged. They were taken. Their names were spoken with tragic reverence, their portraits quietly stored away, their existence reduced to a cautionary tale whispered at plantation dinners. What happens when order fails? Then, slowly, the past began to unearth itself. In 1868, a former house servant named Ruth, now living freely in Richmond, gave a quiet interview to a northern journalist documenting stories of the Old South. She mentioned a fire, a disappearance, and a note that no one was supposed to see. Her account was brief, but it planted a seed of doubt. Years passed. In 1952, during a courthouse renovation, an aging letter from the original housekeeper, Margaret Sullivan, was discovered, tucked between legal ledgers, her handwriting fragile but still legible. She wrote of unusual walks, strange silences, and something in the twins' eyes that no Southern woman was ever meant to hold: defiance. Curiosity grew, but it was 1964 that broke the silence for good. The original Caldwell plantation house was being demolished, its legacy reduced to rubble and dust. During the dismantling of what used to be Catherine's bedroom, a worker found a hidden compartment built into the wall. Inside was a small leather-bound book, weathered by time but intact. Catherine's diary, page after page, written in careful script, told the story not of helpless daughters stolen in the night, but of women who made a choice that defied every law, every expectation, every chain placed upon them. She wrote of Samuel's voice as he read by lantern light. She wrote of the first letter, placed beneath an oak root. She wrote of fear, but she wrote of freedom too. Historians were stunned. This was not a tale of victimhood. It was a record of rebellion. More discoveries followed. In 1968, shipping records revealed 4 passengers departing Savannah under 2 false surnames, Johnson and Davis. In 1969, an archaeological team unearthing the old slave quarters found a small wooden bird carving, matching a description from Catherine's writing, a gift from Samuel, passed in secret during one of their final meetings. Piece by piece, like fragments of a forgotten mosaic, the truth reassembled itself. What Edward Caldwell tried to lock away in silence had begun to speak again, and this time the world was listening.